Whisper Creek Studios.
New Year's Eve in a small Appalachian town can be pretty quiet. And when you're young, sometimes quiet isn't exactly what you're looking for. You want to go somewhere, do something, maybe have a little adventure. And that's exactly what one young couple from Appalachia decided to do. They packed a few things, climbed into the car, and headed on a spur-of-the-moment road trip to spend New Year's Eve somewhere neither of them had ever been before. They were looking for something different, something exciting, and maybe even something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. Well, they found it, because before this trip was over, they would experience a series of things that neither of them could quite explain. And even after they made that long trip back home to the mountains, something just may have followed them home. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday. If you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. In Appalachia can be a lot of different things depending on where you live and what kind of person you are. For some folks, it's a pretty big deal. For others, it's just another night on the calendar. Maybe staying up long enough to watch the ball drop before heading off to bed. And when you live in one of these smaller towns scattered throughout the Appalachian Mountains, your choices can sometimes be a little limited. You might hang out with some friends. Maybe somebody is having a party at their house. Or you might head down to one of the local establishments that's advertising a New Year's Eve celebration. You know, the kind I'm talking about. Maybe they got some live entertainment, an all-night buffet, a few decorations hanging from the ceiling, and they're promising everybody a good time when midnight rolls around. But when you're early 20s, sometimes you want something a little more exciting than that. And that's where a young couple we're going to call Jeff and Christy come into our story. Now, Jeff and Christy aren't their real names. They asked me to change their names because they really don't want people figuring out who they are based on the story I'm about to share with you. And after you hear what happened to them, you might understand why they would rather keep their identities to themselves. Jeff was 22 years old and Christy was 25. They were your regular, run-of-the-mill young Appalachian couple. Both of them working good jobs and living here in a small town in the mountains. As New Year's Eve started getting closer, they began talking about what they wanted to do, and neither one of them was particularly excited about spending it doing the same old thing they could do any other weekend. Jeff and Christy were also the kind of people who could be a little spur of the moment when the opportunity came along. So somewhere in all that talking, they came up with an idea. Why don't we just go somewhere? Not somewhere an hour or two down the road either. If they were going to do this, they wanted to actually go somewhere different. Somewhere they'd never been before, and somewhere they could have a New Year's Eve they would definitely remember. Eventually, they settled on a place, the Big Easy, New Orleans, Louisiana. Two young adults from the mountains of Appalachia were going to pack up a car, make the long drive south, and spend New Year's Eve in the French Quarter, right there around the famous Bourbon Street. At the time, it sounded like a great idea, and to be fair, most of the trip was. But Jeff and Christy were about to get a little more out of New Orleans than either one of them had bargained for. They both had to ask off for a couple extra days from work, and being 22 and 25 years old, they weren't exactly rolling in the money. This wasn't going to be some luxury vacation where they jumped on an airplane, stayed in the nicest hotel in town, and didn't worry about what anything cost. They were going to have to be a little frugal, and one way to do that was to drive. And that's exactly what they did. They packed their clothes, loaded up the car, and started making their way south through the mountains. excited about this little spur-of-the-moment adventure they'd gotten themselves into. And there's something about a road trip like that when you're young. You've got hours ahead of you. You're going somewhere neither one of you have ever been before, and the whole trip is still out there waiting on you. You talk about what you're going to do when you get there, where you're going to eat, what you're going to see, and what you think the place is really going to be like. Jeff and Christy continued through Tennessee, watching those familiar Appalachian towns and mountain ridges disappear behind them as they made their way through Knoxville and down towards Chattanooga. The farther south they traveled, the more unfamiliar everything became. They crossed into Alabama and continued down the interstate, seeing places and signs they'd never seen before, laughing and talking about what they were going to do once they finally got to the Big Easy. Eventually, Alabama gave way to Mississippi, and by that point, those mountains they knew so well were a long way behind them. Then they crossed in to Louisiana. They continued on through Slidell and eventually made their way across Lake Pontchartrain. And before long, after all those hours on the road, they finally arrived in New Orleans. They found their hotel, got checked in, and settled into the room where they'd be spending 3 little nights of their mini vacation. They unpacked their duds, got everything situated, and then started trying to figure out what they wanted to do with their first evening in the city. Of course, they didn't spend very long trying to figure that out. They headed straight for the French Quarter. Now, if you've never been to New Orleans or the French Quarter, let me paint a picture for you, because New Orleans is unlike just about anywhere else in this country. In some ways, it's a city that shouldn't really exist where it does. Parts of New Orleans sits below sea level, built among marshes, swamps, and water, and the city depends heavily on levees and pumps to help keep the water where it's supposed to be. Those pumps are constantly working, moving water out, while those levees stand between parts of the city and the water surrounding it. And when you're there, you can see signs of that struggle. You can walk through the French Quarter and see old buildings leaning to one side or the other, some of them standing there for hundreds of years. You can see uneven streets and sidewalks and all those reminders that this city is built on ground that doesn't always seem particularly interested in holding still. I've always thought there's something strange about that. It's almost like the earth is trying to reclaim New Orleans. Like the water and the land are slowly trying to take back what somebody took from them a long time ago, while the city keeps fighting to stay exactly where it is. And right in the middle of all that is the French Quarter. This is the oldest part of New Orleans, a place filled with old homes and businesses, restaurants, music venues, and shops, all packed together along these narrow streets. You've got old buildings with balconies hanging out above the sidewalks, people moving in every direction, music coming through open doors, and smells from restaurants drifting out into the street. And for 2 young people coming out of small-town Appalachia, it was a completely different world. And then there's the other side of New Orleans, because this city isn't only known for Bourbon Street, music, and food. New Orleans has a darker side to its reputation, too. You've got stories about voodoo. You've got stories about vampires. You've got ghosts and haunted buildings and cemeteries and just about every kind of thing that supposedly goes bump in the night. Whether you believe any of it or not, those stories have become part of New Orleans, and they're part of what draws people there. Jeff and Christy knew some of those stories before they had ever arrived, but they weren't coming down there looking for anything supernatural. They weren't ghost hunters, and they weren't people who necessarily believed every strange story somebody told them. They were just curious about that kind of stuff. That first night, though, they weren't thinking much about ghosts or vampires. They were 2 young Appalachians wandering around New Orleans for the first time, taking everything in. They walked the streets of the French Quarter, tried some of the food, had some gumbo, a crawfish po' boy, maybe a beignet, and did the kind of things you do when you arrive somewhere you've always heard about but have never actually seen it for yourself. Eventually, they made their way back to the hotel. They still had 2 days before New Year's Eve, So that night, they started talking about what else they wanted to do while they were there. The next day, Jeff happened to be down in the hotel lobby, looking through some of those tourist brochures you always find sitting around hotels, advertising just about every attraction a city has to offer. And one of them caught his attention. It was an advertisement for a ghost tour of New Orleans. Now that sounded interesting. Not necessarily because Jeff and Christy believed they were going to walk around the corner and see a ghost standing there waiting on them, but because these tours weren't just about ghosts. They also told you about some of the history of New Orleans, the people who had lived there, the things that had happened inside some of those old buildings, and then, of course, the stories about what supposedly remained behind. So, Jeff took the idea back to Christy, and they decided to give it a try. They'd spend an evening walking through the old streets of New Orleans, listening to some history, and hearing a few ghost stories along the way. It sounded like fun, and at that point, that's all either one of them thought it was going to be. That evening, Jeff and Christy headed back out into the cobblestone streets of the French Quarter to meet up with the group for their ghost tour. And like I said, neither one of them went into this expecting anything to happen. Now, if you've never walked around the French Quarter at night, it's a different experience than walking those same streets during the day. During the daytime, you notice the architecture, you notice the balconies, the shops, the restaurants, and all the people moving about. But after the sun goes down in the Big Easy, those same old buildings take on a different appearance. The streets aren't always particularly bright, especially when you get away from some of the busier areas. You've got those old buildings rising up on either side of you, narrow passageways disappearing between them, iron gates with dark courtyards on the other side, and windows looking down from buildings that have been standing there for generations. The guide led Jeff, Christy, and the rest of the group through the French Quarter, stopping at different locations along the way. They heard some of the history of New Orleans, learned about things that had happened in some of those old buildings, and of course, heard a few ghost stories. For most of the tour, Jeff and Christy were having a good time. Then somewhere along the route, Jeff leaned over towards Christy and said, "I don't feel so good." His stomach had started hurting. And this wasn't just a little rumble from being hungry. Jeff told her he was starting to feel sick to his stomach, almost like he might throw up. But then the group rounded a corner. Their guide stopped everybody and started telling them about the next location on the tour. And during that story, the guide mentioned something that got Jeff's attention. He said, "Oh, by the way, if some of you, when we rounded that last corner, got sick at your stomach, well, that sometimes happens on this tour." Jeff looked at Christy. Christy looked back at him because she knew what he had just told her. Before they'd rounded that corner, and before the guide said anything about people becoming nauseated there, Jeff had already told Christy he was sick at his stomach. Now, was that a coincidence? Maybe. But you've got to admit, the timing was a little strange. They continued on with the group, heard the rest of the stories, and finished the tour without anything else particular unusual happening. And despite the strange little moment with Jeff's stomach, they really enjoyed themselves. They liked hearing the stories. They liked learning some of the history. And apparently their guide could tell everyone was having a good time, because before the group broke up for the evening, another tour was mentioned. A vampire tour. That's right. There would be one going out the following night. Now, after spending an evening walking around New Orleans, listening to ghost stories, a vampire tour through the French Quarter sounded like exactly the kind of thing Jeff and Christy had come down there to experience. So they decided they'd come back the next evening and do just that. With the ghost tour finished, they started making their way back toward the hotel. By this point, New Year's Eve was getting close, and the number of people in the French Quarter seemed to be growing by the hour. There were thousands upon thousands of people packed into that part of the city. People were moving along the sidewalks and spilling out of the restaurants. Music was coming from every direction, and everywhere Jeff and Christy looked, there was someone else. And in a crowd like that, most people don't stand out. You might pass hundreds of faces walking a few blocks and never remember a single one of them. But as Jeff and Christy were making their way back towards the hotel, Jeff happened to look down one of those crowded streets, and somebody caught his attention. there was a man standing among all those people, and this man stood out. Literally. Jeff described him as appearing to be more like 7 feet tall. Whether he was actually that tall, Jeff couldn't say for certain, but that's how he remembers him, because of how much taller he seemed than everybody else standing around him. And he wasn't just tall, he was a big man, the way Jeff described him. He looked like someone you'd expect to see climbing into a wrestling ring. He had long hair, a scruffy beard, and he was dressed completely in black. There wasn't necessarily anything frightening about that. They were in New Orleans, after all. But something happened when Jeff noticed him. The man noticed Jeff too. Their eyes met across the crowd. Just for a moment, there was no conversation. The man didn't approach him. He didn't threaten Jeff, gesture toward him, or do anything else that would give Jeff a reason to think there was a problem. They simply made eye contact. And then Jeff and Christy continued on their way toward their hotel. At the time, Jeff didn't think there was much reason to mention it. Why would he? He looked at a stranger. The stranger looked back. That happens every day. So they got back to the room and settled in for the night. They talked about the ghost tour, the stories they had heard, and that strange moment when Jeff had started feeling sick, just before the guide told them other people had reported the same thing on other tours. But mostly, they were looking forward to the next evening. They were going on a vampire tour through the city of New Orleans. So the next night, they made their way back to the same general meeting place in the French Quarter, and when they arrived, their guide was already there. And this guy looked the part. Jeff remembers him wearing a small top hat and dressed in something resembling a dark tuxedo, looking exactly like the kind of person you expect to lead a group of tourists through the streets of New Orleans at night telling the stories about vampires. Once everyone had gathered, the guide went over some of the basic rules of the tour and explained what they would be doing. They'd be walking through parts of the French Quarter, hearing some of the stories and legends associated with vampires in New Orleans, and about halfway through, they would make a stop at what he described as a real modern-day vampire establishment. Now, Jeff and Christy didn't know exactly what that meant. A vampire establishment? Was this some kind of club? Was it a bar? Were there actually people inside who considered themselves vampires? They didn't know, but it certainly got their attention. The guide explained that it would also serve as a little break during the tour, somewhere everyone could use the bathroom and maybe grab some refreshments before heading back out for the rest of the tour. And with that, they were off. This tour took them in some places that felt a little different from where they'd been before. They walked along old streets and through darker sections of the French Quarter, and at times the guide led them down narrow back alleys where there didn't seem to be much reason for a group of tourists to be walking at all. But that was part of the experience. These old cobblestone streets were surrounded by old buildings, and once you moved away from the bright, busier areas, things could get pretty dark pretty quick. You'd turn down an alley, and suddenly the crowds weren't right there around you anymore. The music from Bourbon Street seemed so far away. The lighting wasn't as bright, and those old spooky buildings rose up on either side of you. So, as a young couple from Appalachia was walking through the dark back alleys in a city that they'd never visited before, following a man dressed like something out of an old vampire movie, while he tells you stories about vampires supposedly connected to the very street you're walking on, well, the feeling probably gets a little uneasy. So, if you don't believe in any of that stuff, your imagination is probably still going to be working a little harder than usual. And at some point during the tour, as the group was making its way along one of those darker areas, Jeff happened to look over to his right. And there he was, the man from the night before. The same unusually tall man with the long hair and scrappy beard. The same big build. And once again, he was dressed completely in black. Jeff recognized him almost immediately. And just like the night before, the man looked at Jeff. And again, they made eye contact. This time, Jeff said something to Christy. Jeff said, "Hey, do you see that big tall guy over there?" And Christy looked over. And Jeff explained that this was the same guy he had noticed the previous night when they were walking back from the ghost tour. And now Jeff started thinking about the odds of all that. The French Quarter was packed with people because of New Year's Eve was approaching. They had walked past thousands of strangers since arriving in New Orleans, and yet somehow, out of all of these people, hundreds of thousands of people, Jeff had noticed this same man twice. And not only had he noticed him twice, but both times the man had looked straight into his eyes. Christy agreed that it was a little strange, but there were plenty of ways to explain it. Maybe the man lived nearby. Maybe he was standing in the French Quarter just like they were. So, after hearing these explanations, they continued on. Eventually, the group reached that modern-day vampire establishment the guide had told them about at the beginning of the tour. And once they got inside, it wasn't some underground crypt with coffins lined against the walls or anything like that. It was basically a novelty-type place connected to vampire culture surrounding New Orleans, somewhere the group could stop for a few minutes, use the restroom, and get a refreshment. Jeff went to use the bathroom. He finished up, opened the door, and came back out into the establishment. He looked over, saw Christy, and then looked back and froze in his tracks. Because there, sitting at the bar, was that same man. The big man, dressed in all black. The same man Jeff had noticed the night before. The same man Jeff had just seen only a few minutes earlier. And now, somehow, he was sitting inside the very establishment where their tour had stopped. This time, Jeff didn't make eye contact with him. In fact, Jeff was starting to get a little freaked out by the whole thing. He found Christy and quietly got her attention. "Look who's sitting over there," he says. Christy looked toward the bar, and much to her surprise, there he was. Now, she'd seen him twice too. She didn't see him the first night, but she saw him moments earlier and now saw him sitting there. And this time, after everything they had heard over the last couple of nights, both of them started getting a little uneasy feeling in the Big Easy. Think about what had been filling their heads since they had arrived in New Orleans. The night before, they'd heard the ghost stories, heard the experiences, Jeff having an experience of his own, seeing this one guy standing out amongst the crowd, thousands of people in New Orleans, and this guy stands out and makes eye contact with Jeff. Then, the next night, he sees him again. And then, a little while later, he sees him again inside this establishment. Now, it still could be all a coincidence. There was nothing the man had actually done to them. He hadn't approached him. He hadn't spoken to them. He hadn't threatened them. But when you're far away from home, in a strange city, and the same person keeps appearing in places where you don't expect him to be, you start paying attention. And Jeff certainly was. Still, they weren't going to let that ruin their night. The tour continued, and eventually the group made its way back to where they started. Jeff and Christy had actually enjoyed themselves. The tour had been fun. They'd heard some interesting stories, and now it was around 9 o'clock. There were about 3 hours left until the new year, and by then, the French Quarter was absolutely jam-packed. Jeff and Christy described the crowds as almost like cattle being packed into a corral. There were so many people squeezed into the streets that moving around was becoming difficult, especially once they got near Bourbon Street. People were everywhere. Music was playing. People were shouting and laughing, and the closer midnight got, the tighter those crowds seemed to become. Jeff and Christy had come to New Orleans specifically to experience New Year's Eve, but once they found themselves right in the middle of it, they were beginning to realize something. This really wasn't their thing. There were too many people. So instead of standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers waiting for midnight, they decided they'd rather find a restaurant, sit down together, and bring in the new year with each other's company. Around 11:30 that night, they found a restaurant that was still open, went inside, and got themselves a table. And that's where they stayed. When midnight finally arrived, The new year came in with all the noise and celebration you would expect from New Orleans. People cheered. Everybody wished each other a happy new year. Even though midnight had come and gone, the celebration certainly wasn't over. There were people everywhere, and Jeff and Christy had to snake their way through the crowds as they worked their way back toward the hotel. And then Jeff says he got a strange feeling. He couldn't really explain it. He just felt like somebody was staring at him. Now, in a crowd that large, somebody probably was looking at him. There were people everywhere you looked, so that feeling alone shouldn't have meant anything. But Jeff turned around anyway. He looked back through the sea of people, and of all those faces, he saw one that he recognized immediately. The long hair, the scruffy beard, the black clothes. The enormous man Jeff had now seen again and again since that first night, and according to Jeff, the man was looking directly at him. By this point, Jeff wasn't brushing it off anymore. He was totally freaked out. Luckily, they weren't far from their hotel, so Jeff and Christy kept moving until they got there, went inside, and made their way up to their room. And they were done for the night. And as Jeff finally tried to get some sleep, everything from the last couple of days was still running around in his head. The ghost stories, the vampire stories, getting sick during the ghost tour, and that man who somehow seemed to keep appearing everywhere he went. Jeff said he had some of the strangest dreams he had ever had that night, the kind of dreams that seemed tangled up in everything he'd heard and experienced since arriving in New Orleans. But morning was coming. They were packing up, they were getting in the car, and heading back to Appalachia. Whatever strange things had happened in New Orleans were about to be 100 miles behind them. Or at least, that's what Jeff thought. The next morning, Jeff and Christy got up, packed their things, and got ready to make their way back home. Their 3 little night adventure in New Orleans had come to an end. They'd seen the French Quarter, walked Bourbon Street, tried some of the food, taken a ghost tour, taken a vampire tour, and brought in the new year together. They'd also experienced a few things neither of them had expected. But now they were on their way back to the mountains of home. And almost from the time they left New Orleans that morning, it started raining. Jeff said it was almost like a black cloud was over them because it rained on them pretty much the entire trip home. The windshield wipers were going back and forth as fast as they could. Water was spraying off the vehicles around them, and mile after mile, the rain just kept coming. That drive was already going to take them somewhere around 14 hours, and with the weather slowing them down, it became an even longer day. They made their way back through Mississippi, then Alabama, and eventually into Tennessee, and then across another state line, back to their hometown in Appalachia. By the time they finally reached home, it was somewhere around 1 o'clock in the morning. Jeff dropped Christy off at her house first. After spending better part of the day together in that car, fighting the rain all the way home, Christy headed inside, and Jeff continued on toward his own house. And this is where you need to understand a little bit about the kind of road Jeff lived on. If you're from Appalachia, especially if you've ever lived out in the country or up one of those smaller mountain roads, you'll know exactly what I mean when I say everybody pretty much knows everybody. And that doesn't mean everybody is sitting around being nosy and keeping tabs on what their neighbors are doing. You just notice things. You notice the vehicles that come up and down the road. You know what your neighbor drives. You notice when there's a different car sitting in somebody's driveway. And if an unfamiliar vehicle comes through late at night, especially around 1 o'clock in the morning, you're probably going to notice that too. Jeff's house was on a dead-end road with only a handful of houses along it. There wasn't anywhere for somebody to go once they got up there. You either stopped at one of those houses, or you eventually had to turn around and come right back out. So Jeff turned off the main road and started making his way towards home. And somewhere along the way, he looked in his rearview mirror and noticed that there was a car behind him. Sure, it was late, but there could have been any number of reasons somebody else was out on that road at that hour. So Jeff kept going. Then he made another turn, and the vehicle behind him turned too. Now Jeff was starting to pay a little more attention. Maybe it was a police officer. Maybe somebody was out patrolling. Maybe it was somebody he knew. Maybe it was somebody going to one of those houses farther up the road. His mind was still running through all those possibilities. And you've also got to remember what had been going through his head for the last couple of days. He'd spent 2 nights in a strange city listening to people talk about ghosts and vampires. He'd gotten sick during the ghost tour, just before the tour guide tells him other people experienced the same thing. And then there was the enormous man dressed in black who had somehow kept appearing again and again. So maybe Jeff was already a little more on edge than he normally would have been. Still, there was nothing particularly alarming about another car being on the road. Then Jeff made the turn onto the road that went by his house. And then the vehicle behind him turned too. Now, he's paying a lot more attention, because this wasn't a through road. This was a dead end. There was no other highway on the other side of it. This road went up through the little neighborhood, came to a cul-de-sac, and that was it. Jeff continued to his house and pulled into his driveway, but he didn't get out. Instead, he sat there in the car and waited. He looked into the mirror and watched those headlights coming toward him. As the vehicle got closer, the lights became brighter in his mirrors. Then, as it got near his house, it sped up and went flying by. Jeff watched it continue up the road. He didn't recognize the vehicle. He couldn't get a particularly good look at it as it passed by, but something about it looked strange to him. And now he was curious. Where was it going? If the driver was visiting somebody further up the road, the vehicle would pull into one of those houses and stay there. But it didn't. Jeff watched it go all around the top of the hill, saw the headlights swing around, and head back down. Once again, the car was coming back by his house. Jeff was still in his car, and he waited. The lights came closer and closer until the vehicle came near his house again, and once again, it sped up and flew by his house. And that's when Jeff had had enough of wondering. He decided to do something about it. If somebody had been up there messing around the neighborhood at 1 o'clock in the morning, he wanted to know who it was. Maybe nothing was going on, but if they woke up the next morning and discovered somebody had broken into a building, stolen something, or been somewhere they shouldn't have, Jeff wanted to at least have a license plate number to tie it to. So he backed out of his driveway and he went chasing after it. The vehicle had a pretty good head start and it was moving fast. Jeff accelerated, trying to close the distance. The strange vehicle reached the next road and turned. Jeff turned behind it, and little by little, he started catching up to him. Now, they were getting into an area where there's a little more light. Dusk-to-dawn lights, a security light here and there, the occasional glow from one of the houses along the road. And every time the vehicle ahead of him passed through one of those patches of light, Jeff could make out a little more of its shape. Something about it didn't look like a regular car. It was long, low, and the closer Jeff got, the more he started trying to figure out exactly what he was looking at. Then, he was close enough to it now to try to make it out as the vehicle passed beneath another light, and Jeff realized what it was. It was a hearse. Jeff couldn't believe it. A hearse at 1 o'clock in the morning, driving up and down a dead-end road in the mountains of Appalachia. And now, after everything he had experienced over the last few days, his mind really started going. Now, he really wanted that tag number, so he kept following. The hearse was still moving quickly, but Jeff continued closing the distance until his headlights could reflect off the license plate. And when Jeff saw it, he slammed on the brakes, turned around, and went back home. He jumped out of his car and ran straight into his house and went to bed and pulled the covers over his head. Why? Well, because there, on the back of that hearse, hundreds of miles from the streets of the city of New Orleans, were Louisiana license plates. Thank you for listening to Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider following the podcast and leaving a review. It really does help others discover these Appalachian stories. Until next time, I'm Kevin Austin, and remember, every root tells a story, and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.